Hey everyone, it's John here, and in this video we're going to take a look at 5 super obscure pivot table tips. Let's get started. In this first tip, we're going to take a look at one of the most common errors with pivot tables. So when you add new data, it's not going to show up in your pivot table unless you refresh the pivot table. So to refresh the pivot table, you can right-click on it and select refresh. But there is actually a way to automatically refresh your pivot tables. And so if you go to the pivot table options, if you right click on the pivot table and open up pivot table options, then in the data tab here, we have this option to refresh the data when opening the file. So we can check that off and press OK. And now each time you open your Excel workbook, your pivot table is going to refresh, and you can at least be assured that you will have the latest results in your pivot table whenever you open the file. In this tip, we're going to see how we can save a default layout for your pivot tables. So when you create a pivot table, it's going to use the default layout options, but you can change these in the design tab. So for example, you might want to change the report layout into outline or tabular form. But if you want this layout for all of your pivot tables, then whenever you create a new pivot table, you're going to have to adjust those options unless you set them as a default. So we can set a default up in the File tab. And if we go to Options, and in the Data tab, we have this Edit Default Layout button. And this is going to allow us to set the default layout for our pivot tables. So here we can actually import the options from a given pivot table. So we can select a cell inside our pivot table and click on Import, or we can manually adjust the different options. And we can also set default pivot table options. So we can set defaults for any of these options in the Layout and Format tab, Totals and Filter tab, Display, Printing, or Data tab. Then we can press OK to save our default and press OK to close the Excel options menu. And now whenever we create a new pivot table, it's going to have those layout options as well as default pivot table options. In this tip, we're going to take a look at creating a relative calculated item. So first up, let's take a look at what a calculated item is. So we can create one by selecting any item, going up to the Analyze tab, Fields, Items, and Sets, and Calculated Item. And this is going to allow us to name our calculated item, as well as give it a formula. So here, let's create a formula that takes 10% of our bike stand item. And let's add that and press OK. And then we get our calculated item down here. And you can see that its value is 10% of our bike stand total. Now let's see how we can create a relative reference. So again, let's select an item in our pivot table, go up to the Analyze tab, Fields, Items, and Sets, Calculated Item, and this time let's modify our existing calculation. And here, what we want to do, instead of referencing this item, let's reference the entire subcategory field. So to reference a single item, we're going to use square brackets after our field name and then add in an index number. So for example, -1 is going to refer to the previous item. Let's modify that and press OK. And now you can see that our calculated item is 10% of the previous item. And if we move this in our pivot table, then that calculation is going to change based on the previous item. So now we've got 10% of our gloves. Let's change this to -3 and press enter. And now we're taking 10% of the item 3 places above. We can also reference items below. So if we change this to plus, and let's try +3. Now we're taking 10% of the item 3 places below. And if we omit this plus sign, what's going to happen is we're now taking 10% of the 3rd item in our pivot table. So here our value is 10% of the 3rd item. So that's how you can create relative references with your calculated items. In this tip, we're going to take a look at converting an existing pivot table into a data model pivot table. So when you first create a pivot table, it's going to give you the option to add the data into the data model. But if you create your pivot tables without this option and later want to use it, you can still do that. So you can select your pivot table, and in the pivot table fields window, under the list of all the fields, we have this text here, more tables, and it's actually a button. So if you click on it, it's going to ask you if you want to create a new pivot table. And this is going to be a pivot table based on the data model. Let's click yes. And then Excel is going to produce the exact same pivot table based on a data model. And then this is going to give you access to relationships and DAX formula measures, among other things. In this last tip, we're going to take a look at how we can convert a pivot table into formulas. So if you have a data model pivot table, then you can convert this into formulas quite easily. And this is going to give you the ultimate control over the layout of your results. So we can select our pivot table and go up to the Analyze tab, and under OLAP tools, we have this option to convert to formulas. Let's click on that. And that's going to convert our pivot table into a series of individual formulas. So here you can see that each of these values is now from a cube value formula. And this cube value formula references the data model as well as the items from our data. Since these are individual formulas, you can now move these any place that you would like in your spreadsheet. Let me know in the comments below, how many of these obscure tips did you know? Also, if you have your own obscure tip that wasn't featured here, let me know in the comments. I'd like to hear that as well. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel for future Excel videos like this one. That's it for this video. We'll see you in the next one.